So the goal is to go through the docs here, basically, or this Tailwind v4 announcement blog post here, and find out what's new. And of course, we'll play around with it in some small demo project, because that's always more exciting and also always more useful than just reading stuff, though we will also do that. Now, therefore, it probably makes sense to start with this point here, the third point, and then I'll get back to the first two, since that is about a simplified installation, which makes sense if you want to create a new project and play around with Tailwind. So that's what I'll do here. And I will create a Vite project. I'll create a simple React demo project with which we can play around. And therefore, I'll actually head over to my terminal. And thank you so much, Grelian, for subscribing. Super appreciated. And you're still... And also, thank you so much for hitting that first goal. You're the 10th subscriber. I was just about to say, you're still amongst the first 10 subscribers. You actually were number 10. Super amazing. Thank you so much. So yeah, hi everyone. Hi Stefano and Grelian. Nice to hear that I was able to help you with Flutter. So hopefully this today here is also helpful. So I'll actually create a new Vite project here, a Vite React project, and I'll name it TW4 for Tailwind 4. Not too important. It'll be a React project, and I'll use plain old JavaScript here to keep things simple. And then I'll open that project with VS Code. Of course, we could also use cursor and all that, but I actually don't want too much AI assistance here, because I want to, well, play around with those new features and don't have everything completed by AI. Also, because of course, AI would probably give us a lot of Tailwind version 3 completions, since Tailwind version 4 is brand new and the AI doesn't really know about it. And yes, we could add links to the documentation to cursor, but again, I want to play around with that on my own here. So let me switch to my streaming profile here, zoom out a bit, and let's then explore what's new about the setup here, because that is part of what's new in version 4, as they tell us. And in general, as I said, I briefly had a look at the blog post here and version 4, and it seems like the big theme, or one of the most important topics they had with that version, was to really make setting up and using Tailwind simpler. They also added a lot of new features, some exciting stuff, but they also really worked on making it simpler to use it. And you can already see that here, if you take a look at the installation. It's just a bunch of steps, and if you compare that to the old installation steps, so if we go back to version 3 and then take a look at the installation there, here. So now I'm on version 3. There you actually had to first install Tailwind and run this command. Then you had to tweak the Tailwind config to tell Tailwind which files to be aware of, essentially. You had to set up the CSS file, or one CSS file, by adding a bunch of Tailwind directives here. You had to run this command, though only if it was not Vite, but you had to go through all these steps. Now with version 4, it's only this command you need to run to install Tailwind. And then I think if you're using Vite, you don't actually have to go through this step here. Instead, you can just tweak your Vite config by adding this Vite specific plugin. And then you have to import this thing, add this one import to your CSS file. So no Tailwind directives. You don't have to work in the Tailwind config file anymore. I believe there isn't even a config file anymore. You can still configure stuff, but it works in CSS files now, because it actually now is smarter when it comes to detecting which files are using Tailwind classes and which files should therefore be taken into account. So that's all pretty nice. And therefore, in this Vite project, I'll run this command here to install Tailwind and Tailwind CSS post CSS. And then I'll make sure to update my Vite config accordingly, so that I'll add this Tailwind CSS plugin to it. So in my Vite config, I'll import Tailwind CSS from Tailwind CSS Vite, and then here add it as a plugin to the plugins array, in addition to React, of course, since I'm still also using that. And then I think, yeah, we just have to add this import here. Let's say to the index CSS file, I'll replace it entirely with that import, since I only want to use Tailwind. I don't want to add any custom CSS, so that's all I have in there. And I'll get rid of app CSS, clean up the app.jsx file, and just say hello world in there. And hopefully we should now see something on the screen. If I save everything, if I run npm install to install all other dependencies, since you always need to do that when using Vite, and then if I start my development server, I'm getting an error. Cannot find package Tailwind CSS Vite. Okay, yeah. So I guess I can use Tailwind CSS Vite instead of the post CSS version. Let's see if I clean this all up and run npm install again. I guess it would have been a good idea here for this installation to go to the official documentation and not to the blog announcement post, which just highlights the differences or highlights. If I would have went straight to the installation docs, because of course all these docs have been updated to version 4, I would have seen that I need to run, that I need to install the Vite plugin and not the post CSS one, which makes sense. So now we did that, and with that done, that works. And if I now visit localhost 5173, that's very bright, I know, but this here is working. And we can add dark mode soon, no worries, it won't stay that bright. But we see hello world, and we see, and that's important, that it does not have the default browser styles, which proves that Tailwind is doing something. It's resetting those default styles. If we inspect this here in the DevTools, we can also see, I guess in the head, yeah, that there is Tailwind being imported and that it's setting up some stuff. By the way, this add layer thing here is an official CSS feature, which is getting used by Tailwind now. It's a directive, I think it's called, built into CSS, which you can use to kind of control the specificity of different rules that may affect the same element. Historically, that has always been super tricky, or a potential pitfall with CSS, this whole specificity thing. With that layer thing, it, I think, gets a bit easier. But you don't have to worry about that. Tailwind takes care of that for you. So that is how we can add it, as it seems. Hi Max, great to see you again. What happened to the previous project with Next.js? Did you find the fix for the text area prop error you were getting? I did actually not continue that project, might do that in a future stream, but it was really mostly about playing around with better auth, and we did that. I might finish it in some future stream, but for now I want to focus on Tailwind and also get some other ideas for future streams, so we'll see. But I will say, of course, I do cover how to set up polymorphic components with React and TypeScript in my React and TypeScript course, or if you don't want to pay for that, which is perfectly fine, if you search for React TypeScript, there is a pretty decent page. Not sure where it is. There is a pretty decent page which also has some good recipes for common problems. Maybe this one here, not sure. Yeah, I think so. There you can also learn about some common patterns like polymorphic components. So that might be interesting to you too. Or my course, of course. But today it's about Tailwind 4. Your book is amazing. I've just started with React key concepts. Hey, Blade Runner, that's amazing. Thank you so much. Really means a lot to me. I put a lot of effort into this book. I actually spent a lot of time last year updating it for React 19. Of course, put a lot of effort in the book before that when I wrote the first edition and then when I updated it. So super happy to hear you're liking it. So now that we got Hello World working, let's go back to that announcement blog post. Let's see what's new. So the installation got simpler. We have less steps and less configuration to go through. But what else is new? Let's start at the very top. We have a new high-performance engine where full builds are up to 5 times faster and incremental builds are over 100 times faster and measured in microseconds. So essentially, I think the idea here is that, of course, when you're using Tailwind, it is essentially whenever you save your changes, and especially when you build your project for production, it's scanning all your files or all the files it considers important, like all your JSX files, your HTML files, and so on. It scans them for Tailwind classes, and then it produces a bundle or a bunch of CSS code that gets injected into the final website that only includes the CSS classes, the Tailwind stuff that you really need. And that entire build process of scanning and producing that bundle, that now got quicker, as it seems, which of course matters because for big projects, you don't want to wait a long time whenever you save changes or build your project. So now it looks like fully building a project in their benchmark project here took only 100 milliseconds now with version 4 compared to almost 400 milliseconds when using version 3.4. And incremental rebuilds, which they probably do during development, where they only like pick up the changes you actually made and rebuild those, are even faster, like super fast. And if you don't change anything, it's barely measurable, I guess. So that's great. Better performance. That's amazing. So yeah, we take that, I'd say. Nothing we have to change, and we just get a quicker experience. Design for the modern web. The platform has evolved a lot since we released Tailwind version 3, and 4.0 takes full advantage of many of these improvements. Yeah, as I said, for example, internally, they're now using this layer feature for managing specificity. So basically for controlling which styles and rules override potentially clashing rules. But they also have like other features like color mix, which helps with dynamically producing colors essentially instead of hard coding all the variants you want, and other stuff. Again, not something we have to really be aware of or use in our code, but we get for free, and which potentially unlocks more powerful Tailwind supported features. So that is pretty nice. How can I buy the book? You can buy it on Amazon. If you go to amazon.com, search for React Key Concepts. That's my book. That's the second edition here. By the way, thanks everyone if somebody's here who gave it a good rating. Really appreciate that. So you can get it from there. Alternatively, you can also go to this URL, which I'll paste into the chat here. At least I'm trying. Okay, why won't you let me? Here we go. And there you'll also find links and some extra information, also some packages where you can get some goodies if you buy more copies and so on. So that's that. Sang-Yoons, hello Max, it's funny to see you doing a stream. I normally watch your courses on Udemy. I would like to thank you for all the courses you took, which were and are a great help. At the moment, I'm only working in JavaScript thanks to your courses. I hope one day you have a Nest.js course, which seems to be an interesting topic. Thank you so much for being part of the courses. I'm super happy that they were helpful. I've said that in past streams, and I'll say it again. It's always, and I mean it, it's always super exciting for me to like hear feedback like this, because I create those courses, and from that point on, sure, I get reviews, there is some interaction, but hearing back from people that took my courses and that now have a job or anything else because of those courses is always amazing. Really means a lot to me. So thank you so much. Hi, not a hacker. Nice to have you here. Okay, so back to Tailwind. We got some new internal workings, features being used. Great. We got the simpler installation, and we got this automatic content detection, which I already mentioned, which essentially means that there is less configuration for us to do, or actually no configuration regarding that, because it automatically has a smart detection algorithm, if you want to call it like this, for determining which files to consider when scanning for Tailwind classes and which files to leave out. And they also tell us, if you ever need to explicitly add a source, so if you need to include something they're not detecting correctly, you can always add it with the source directive right in your CSS file. And that's also something I said before. As mentioned, I only briefly took a look at what's new, but one thing I noticed is that it seems as if all the configuration you can do is now done right inside of CSS files. There is no configuration JavaScript file anymore. So for example, if you want to include some file to be considered by Tailwind, you do that in your CSS file. So in our project, that would be the index CSS file. If I wanted to include some other file, I could add source and then the path to that file that should be considered by Tailwind. That's how I understand this. Okay, so that's of course pretty nice. Yeah, Ansible. I also find that pretty interesting, and also I think I like it. I haven't worked a lot, or actually at all, with version 4, so not sure if working in CSS only can get annoying for some niche configuration stuff maybe. But that being said, oftentimes I didn't have to configure a lot except for theming and so on. So if that works fine, I think it should be great. Hey Max, doing your React Native course right now. I have stuck in authentication part, want to implement SMS one-time password verification. Can you suggest some free tier API for that? I think when it comes to adding authentication, including one-time password stuff, BetterAuth, a library I started exploring in my last stream, might be interesting for you. It's TypeScript only, so that could be a downside, but it's extremely powerful. And it, for example, has built-in support for one-time passwords and stuff like that. And it has a guide for Expo apps, so React Native apps in the end, too. Yeah, and it helps with one-time password, passkeys, all that stuff. So that might be interesting. I will probably also cover this again in future streams. And maybe also courses, of course. Okay, so CSS-first or only configuration is a thing. Built-in import support. Before v4, if you wanted to inline other CSS files using @import, you'd have to configure another plugin like post-CSS import to handle it for you. Now we handle this out of the box, so you don't need any other tools. So if I want to go to my CSS file and import some other file, which is not related to Tailwind, some other CSS file, which I want to merge or connect to this file, I can just use @import. That's how I understand this, and it will just work. And then here we have the CSS-first configuration. So one of the biggest changes in Tailwind CSS v4 is the shift from configuring your project in JavaScript to configuring it in CSS. So sounds like it's really just CSS, no more JS file. So instead of having that config.js file, you can configure all of your customizations directly in the CSS file where you import Tailwind, giving you one less file to worry about in your project. Yeah, that's nice. Okay, so if I now want to adjust my theme, which is one of the most common things you typically want to do in your configuration, I guess, at least it was for me, it seems we're now doing this with @theme. By the way, again, this is just the announcement blog post, which gives us a high-level overview. Of course, there's still the official documentation with all the details. So if we wanted to learn how to theme our application, I guess we could dive right into the theming guides here and learn more about that. But for the overview, I'll stick to this post here. Are you going to do another CSS-based project today? No, I'll stick to Tailwind for today, but we will write some code. We'll not just read this. For example, actually, we could start writing some code. Go back to app.jsx here, or actually to index.html, I guess. And for example, give our body a class, and here it's class, not class name, because it's the index.html file of bg. Whoops. Do I get any auto-completion here? No. Okay, so I actually don't want to switch my keyboard type. That's annoying. Okay. It's not a big problem. I know the class, and I guess we will get some completion in the JSX files. So let's see. Text, I don't mean that, I mean that. So if I now take a look at this, we got the gray background, we got the white text. And now in app.jsx, I could add a main element, for example, here. And then add class name. And here, for example, well, yeah, let's add a class name here and set this to my8 to have some spacing to the top and bottom. And let's give this here a class name of font bold. And now let's say we want to change our color. So we want to give this a color of, let's say, red 400. So that should work, and it has this style. I'll also center it. But now let's say we want to change this color. We don't want to use the default red color, but we want to change that. So my understanding is that I now go to this index CSS file and I add this theme directive, which is supported by Tailwind. And then in there, I add curly braces, and then between those curly braces, I can add CSS variables, which probably, that's my assumption, map to the class names I'm using in Tailwind. So if I want to change the red 400 color, I would add a dash color dash red 400 variable, and then I can set my own color. And here they're using this, I think, new OKLCH function. I have to admit, I'm not 100% sure what this function does. Define some color, I guess, but you should also be able to use a hex code or stuff like that. So we can give this a try. If I add my curly braces here, and I then add color red 400 and set this to I don't know, to this red color here. That's now probably my red color. To confirm that this is the case, if I set this to blue, it's blue. So, okay, this is how we can tweak the configuration. That is what we previously had to do in the JavaScript config file, and now we're doing it here in the CSS file. Maybe Tailwind IntelliSense needs to be updated as well. Yeah, that's possible. I have to say, today I also installed like a second keyboard, which has like a US layout, and that's why I had to basically set up my Mac to be able to switch between input sources. but I don't want to do that with a keyboard shortcut. So not sure how I can disable that, but it's also not too important, I guess. Yeah, I have the latest version of the Tailwind CSS IntelliSense, so I guess it should work here. And anyways, we can just type the classes, so not a huge issue. But of course, that is a pretty big change. Configuring through CSS instead of JavaScript is a pretty big change. And again, it would probably be a good idea to dive into the to learn all about that. Oh, and it looks like I reached a follower goal. Sure, I absolutely knew that I had an alert set up for that. But thank you all so much for following. So if I wanted to tweak, for example, my breakpoints for the responsive design, I could learn more about that in the official docs under responsive design, customizing your theme. And here we learn that, again, we do it in the CSS file only, and we can define our own breakpoints here like that. And I think if I switch back to the old version, okay, it does not stay on the page, unfortunately, but in the old version, you had to do that in the JavaScript file, and you had to configure it like this. And now you instead do it like this, which is simpler, I would say, and it also is nice, at least for me, if you have one less configuration file, and instead you can do it all in CSS. Oh my god, that was loud. I do apologize for that. I have to tune down those alerts a little bit. Yeah, let me see if I can adjust the alert. I did actually already try to reduce the volume of those alerts already, but seems like I did not do that enough. So let me see. Huh. Wow, this Twitch thing is complex. You would imagine there is just like an easy to use volume slider, but of course there isn't, or I'm blind. So I do apologize for having those loud alerts. I'll have to figure that out after the stream. Yeah, keyboard switching, I feel the pain. Yeah, keyboard switching can be annoying. I use Streamlabs, but those alerts you just saw are set up directly from inside Twitch. And there are a million things I can configure regarding them. I can unfortunately not tune down the alert volume from inside OBS, as it seems. Oh, I can control audio via OBS. Never mind. I think I can. Yeah, that should work. Okay, so alerts should not be as loud now. Okay, back to Tailwind. So CSS configuration, pretty nice to have. CSS theme variables. Tailwind CSS v4 takes all of your design tokens and makes them available as CSS variables by default, so you can reference any value you need at runtime using just CSS. Using the example add theme from earlier, all of these values will be added to your CSS as regular custom properties. Oh, okay. So that is actually pretty sweet. So this means when I set up a variable here, it's not just changing the styles Tailwind applies to the red color in this case. It does that, but not just. But besides doing that, it's also simply made available as a CSS variable. So I could, in theory, add another file, let's say app.css, if I wanted to also include my own CSS styles, I guess. So I could do that and then import app.css here into app.jsx. And in there, I could set up my own CSS rule, target main, and let's say add a margin or give it let's say a max width. And to be honest, I typically don't do that. Typically, I only use Tailwind, but I could do something like this, give it some max width, set the margin to order, and give it a border of 2 pixels solid. And now I guess I can use color red 400. So this CSS variable that I defined here, and that I hope works. Yeah, it does. It does now have that color. So I can use those variables not just for configuring Tailwind, but I can then use them wherever I need them, which is pretty neat. What if you make a Twitch clone while streaming on Twitch? So maybe not a fully fledged Twitch clone. I think it is a bit too ambitious for me to clone something like this in its entirety. But building projects, also bigger projects, is definitely something I would love to do on stream. So it's definitely something I'm considering for this year, yes. A stream exploring the Twitch API, for example, would be interesting. Like building my own extensions where I maybe automatically read the chat and handle that in some way with an LLM or create use some voice AI to have some messages being read out. I know this has been done before, but that would be something that could be interesting. Absolutely. Okay, so this entire CSS configuration and usage stuff here is pretty interesting and good. Dynamic utility values and variants. We've simplified the way many utilities and variants work in v4, effectively allowing them to accept certain types of arbitrary values without the need for any configuration or dropping down to the arbitrary value syntax. For example, in Tailwind v4, you can create grids of any size out of the box, like this. You can also target custom Boolean data attributes without needing to define them. Oh, that is nice. So that means we are no longer restricted to just creating a grid with either 14 or 16 columns, or with defining our own column size in the configuration. Instead, we can now just use any value we want. I wonder, I keep going to the wrong screen. I wonder if we can also do things like, well, I'm changing the margin here, of course, from inside the CSS file, but I wonder if I can do things like, let's say, set up a padding and now not just use 4 or 2 or 3, but also arbitrary values here. Can I, for example, also use 4.5 or things like that? So if I inspect this, does this work? Yeah, it does. It does. So I can add even classes like this, and it then dynamically calculates the spacing by multiplying some variable, which has a default value of .25 rem. And of course, we could overwrite that in that add theme block. But I can essentially build up on this space variable, no matter if I overrode it or not, and then just use any value I want after this dash here to multiply it and dynamically set up any padding or margin or, I guess, border width or whatever I want to set up. So that is, of course, pretty neat. That is pretty nice. Means we don't have to go back to the config to set up that special margin we need in one place of the app. Oh, DevTools are behind the cam. Sorry about that. I'll move them to the left in the future. So yeah, pretty nice to be able to set this. I mean, of course, you always were able to use arbitrary values. That was always a thing, and you could always set up a specific REM or pixel value like this. That worked in version 3.2. But now, of course, you don't need to fall back to that. Instead, you can set up such a multiple of that base value by just using this dynamic class name, which is pretty nice. Max, I really like your courses. I took several of them already and have to admit they give me the tools to land my most recent jobs. Thank you so much again and again. By the way, really craving for a Nest.js course, please. Yeah, thank you so much, Mario Graph. Super amazing to hear that my courses were helpful to you and that they got you a job. That is really amazing, and congratulations to that, of course. And regarding Nest.js, I forgot about that. It was asked about it earlier too. I have not worked too much with Nest.js, so a Nest.js course is pretty unlikely right now, to be very honest. I won't rule it out entirely. Maybe I can also include it in some other course, like in my Node.js course, but a standalone course is not super likely right now, unfortunately. Okay, so that is a great change, being able to like dynamically set those classes. I like that a lot. Yeah, so that's great. What else do we have? Modernized P3 color palette. Okay, so internally, they're now using this. What is this thing? This OCLC. The OCLC functional notation expresses a given color in the OCLAP color space. What is the OCLAP color space? OCLC is the cylindrical form of OCLAP. Of course, sure, yeah, I figured it was the cylindrical form. Using the same L-axis, but with polar, chromer, and U coordinates. Okay, that is not entirely in my space of expertise, I have to admit. If any one of you knows what that means, please let me know. Okay, yeah, I won't turn this into an OCLC stream. How's browser support? Okay, pretty good. So I guess it's simply a better way of calculating or defining colors in CSS. Probably gives us a broader range of colors we can describe. That would be my assumption. And yeah, taking advantage of the wider gamut to make the colors more vivid in places where we previously were limited by sRGB color space. Okay, so we got more vivid colors. That's, of course, a really nice thing to have. And man, I'm really loving those Tailwind CSS color palettes. I think they're really awesome. And to be very honest, I think you can get a lot of projects done by just sticking to all the Tailwind defaults. Of course, eventually, for your own site, you might want to bring in your own fonts, of course, and you might want to tweak those colors. But honestly, for some projects, you can probably just bring in the font and stick to the default colors, and you might be able to build really good-looking pages that still don't look like all the other pages. Not sure how to express it, but I'm really loving those color palettes. HSL better than LCH. Okay, possible. I am preparing for placement right now, Max. Doing data structures and algorithms for some time in C++. Still can't solve the problems on my own. What should I do? So I will say data structures and algorithms are really tricky. It's been quite some time since I last did hardcore data structures and algorithms stuff, which sounds weirder than I mean it to sound, but I would probably have a hard time doing the more advanced things just like that right now too. Now, what helped me get better back when I really dug super deep into data structures and algorithms was really just building and building the same data structures and writing the same algorithms over and over again, sometimes with minor variations, but sometimes also just the same data structures. And that's important, not to learn them by heart, but really just to get into that way of thinking and to learn and remember those core building blocks like while loops, recursion, and all that standard stuff which you need to use in certain ways for all or for most of these algorithms and data structures. That is what helped me the most. And of course, like what also helped me a lot was like whiteboarding, like really drawing how these algorithms and data structures worked, what happened if you went through multiple steps of recursion, multiple levels of recursion, if you went through iterations, like drawing down every iteration and how an array or whatever it is changes. That is what really made it click for me at some point. Might not work for everyone, but it did definitely help me. That's probably the best advice I can give. I guess what you can also do is like practice on lead code. I have never done this, but that might be a nice place to have like a more gamified environment to also practice this, which might also help with motivation. I used to work in C++ for game development. Let's just say I'm happy to be working in web development and never needing to look at a pointer again. Yeah, I feel you. I think in game development, you also have to deal with a lot of data structures and algorithms, a lot of path calculations and graphs and stuff. And actually, game development is something that I find super interesting. I always wanted to do game development and never did it. So maybe I'll do that sometime later this year too. But I do believe it is really challenging. Okay, back to Tailwind. We got support for container queries. We've brought container query support into core for v4, so you don't need the special plugin anymore. Now, I haven't used container queries a lot, or actually almost not at all, I guess. But I think they can be really amazing. So why don't we play around with them here? And maybe we can just stick to the example they're giving us here. So we can add a div here, and let's add a class name here and add some margin to the top, and also add like a border so that we can see this. Border gray 300, yeah, why not? And in there, I'll just copy in this code. In there, I'll have a nested div, which sets up a CSS grid with one column by default. But then, depending on the size of the outer container, which we need to mark with add container, depending on that size, it will change the number of columns. So if we have pretty much no space, if it's a super small container, we have one column. If it's a bigger one, we have 3. If it's an even bigger one, we have 4 columns in here. So I guess in here, we can add more divs. And of course, semantically, that's not that great, but good enough for now. I can add a couple of divs, like let's say 4 divs. And then I'll give every div, actually here I'll add a gap to have some spacing between all those boxes. And then here add a border yellow 300, let's say. And then essentially repeat this with different colors here. Whoops. With different colors. So here we could use blue, and here we could use orange, I think. And here we could use, I don't know, indigo is a color, I guess. So now I have these boxes, and here I have them all next to each other. So I have 4 columns because I'm viewing this full screen. Now, if I open my developer tools, and I want to use those, I want to send those to the left here. So if I do that and I shrink this, we can already see now we get, so we have 4 columns initially, then we get 3 columns at some point. And if we shrink this further, we got 1 column. And of course, we can also achieve this with standard media queries, but the difference is that for container queries, and that's a standard CSS feature, which now is just enabled by Tailwind 2, but it's not Tailwind specific. But the thing is that these boxes here inside of that container are, or the layout of these boxes simply depends on the container they're in, not on the entire width of the overall document or page, which would be the case with media queries. And this means that if I were to put this container that includes the boxes in some space where it does not have as much width available, it would resize its content even if the page size did not change. So for example, if I go to that div here, which has this add container thing, so which is as I understand it, responsible for controlling whether a resizing is triggered or not. If I set the width here to, let's say to, I don't know, to 20 rem, then I have this one column layout, even though the page width hasn't changed, but the container width has changed. And that's the idea behind container queries. And it is, of course, pretty nice to have that built-in support now, because that really simplifies building reusable components, essentially. Because this here could be a React component that displays the latest news, let's say. It has a bunch of news items. And we might want to use that in different areas of our page. We might want to use it on the sidebar of some dashboard page, but we might want to use it in the main area of the starting page, for example, whatever. And depending on where it's used and how much space, how much width is available, we therefore want to resize the content. And without container queries, that's super hard to do, because media queries are not the right tool, because the page width is always the same. It's just the place where we use this box, where we use this container, that has a different width, essentially. So that's why container queries are awesome, and why having support for them in Tailwind without any extra package or plugin is pretty awesome. So for building reusable components, this is a killer feature, essentially. So I'm glad people like you exist, because I do not. Yeah, maybe I don't enjoy game development either. I haven't tried it, so I don't know. Those dangling pointers and dynamic data allocation every time to optimize data storage. Yeah. So I guess that's the thing with C and C++, and I have not written C or C++ in a long time, but I think the nice and not so nice thing about these low-level dangers, about those low-level languages, is the high degree of control you have, and that's also the downside. But of course, yeah, obviously there is a reason why they're getting used for performance-critical applications. So I would love to get back into that at some point. Oh, neat, I might ditch Bootstrap for this. My biggest issue is responsive design. So I have not worked with Bootstrap in a long time. Last time I checked, they also had utility classes like Tailwind, but I feel like it feels like nobody's using Bootstrap anymore, which probably is wrong. I mean, that would be interesting. How does the Bootstrap package on NPM do? I mean, that's really interesting. This package is needed for some parts of Bootstrap, the parts that need JavaScript, and it has not been updated in a year now, but it's getting 4 million or 3.8 million downloads every week, which is still a lot. So that's not too shabby. Tailwind is getting 10 million, so quite a lot more, but still Bootstrap is getting used a lot, but it feels sometimes as if nobody's using it. So yeah, that's weird. I mostly just use the grid. Yeah, when I used Bootstrap like 10 or 8 years ago, when everybody was using Bootstrap and all the pages looked the same, I felt like the grid was the most important part, because back then we had to deal with floats and stuff like that. Flexbox wasn't a big thing back then. It existed, but support wasn't great. So man, those were different times. You had to use, or using Bootstrap for the grid really simplified things a lot. And now I think we're on that next step of evolution with Tailwind, where we can have this fine-grained control, where you still don't need to know a lot about CSS, and where you can put it all into one file, which can also be a problem. But yeah, where you can move really fast and build amazing UIs without diving into the depths of CSS, which can also be interesting, but which can also be annoying. Okay, so container queries, nice. New 3D transform utilities. We've finally added APIs for doing 3D transforms like rotate X and so on. Okay, so I guess here you also, you put like this perspective class, or I guess there are different perspectives you can choose from on an outer element. And then on the inner element, you can control how the element is transformed in a 3D space. And you control, I guess, the general style of the transformation with that class on the outer element. I would have to check back to the documentation to see which choices we have here. Yeah, but it is pretty neat to be able to have 3D transforms unlocked by just Tailwind without writing any special configuration or custom CSS styles. Expanded gradient APIs. We've added a ton of new gradient features in V4, so you can pull off even fancier effects without having to write any custom CSS. Okay, so in Tailwind 3, if I go back to the docs, of course we had gradient support. But it was pretty basic, I have to say. You could essentially say, okay, I want to have a background gradient from, I think you could say from the bottom to the top right and things like that. But you had not a lot of control over that gradient. It was nice. It was good enough for many use cases, but it sounds like now we got more control. For example, we can set the angle, and I would assume we can also do that by using any value here, any value we want. So I could also use 41, I guess, if I wanted to. And then we can control with which color we start, which color we want to have in between, and we can probably have multiple colors here. I guess we can try that, right? So let's copy this. Let's add another div here. Class name. Add that, and then in here have some text, linear gradient, whatever. And let's also add a margin here, MT8. So, and I will also add a margin, actually here, a margin to the bottom of 50 rem, just so that I can, I see, I control the margin here. Okay, so let's do 4 rem to the top, auto left and right, 40 rem to the bottom, auto here, just so that I can scroll down a bit better and move that up here in the screen. So, okay, we can set this gradient. Now, what if I wanted to also add via green 5 or 400 here? Okay, so there is just one via class, I guess. So if I add 2, purple and green, it looks like the first one wins here. There is no green in here. But okay, still, we got this control. And I guess we can control the angle. So as I said, if I want to have like 32 here, I don't get an error. And I guess it looks like a different angle than before. Let's see here. Yeah, so these via classes are not active. It's just one class that's active, but that's fine. Yeah, and I can use any angle here. So that's pretty nice. That is pretty nice. Is there anything else we can do with gradients? You may also notice we've renamed BG gradient to BG linear too. You'll see why shortly. Okay, I assume we don't have, we're not limited to linear gradients anymore, but we probably also have like radial and maybe other gradients too. I've grown old, no, I already, people using Material UI or Shared CN more now. Yeah, especially like Shared CN is like the default Tailwind styled React component library these days, because all these LLMs spit out React code with Shared CN as a default. At least that is how it seems to me. So yeah, that's good for the Shared CN project, I guess. I still use Bootstrap mostly out of laziness. The JavaScript saves you time. Yeah, and there is nothing wrong with that. I have to say that. You don't have to use the one shiny thing everybody uses. You can use whatever gets the job done for you. That can be Bootstrap, that can be Material, CSS, that can be vanilla CSS you write on your own, of course. So whatever gets the job done is great. Are you familiar with Daisy UI? If so, what do you think about it? So I am not. At least it doesn't ring a bell for me now. Tailwind CSS components. So it's a component library building up on Tailwind CSS, I guess. Yeah, but I haven't used it, so I actually don't have any thoughts about it, but I personally don't really use Tailwind component libraries at all, I guess, because for me, it kind of defeats the purpose of using Tailwind. That being said, of course, I see the advantage of not having to write code like this myself, but instead using a pre-built button. So absolutely, it can speed things up just as Shared CN and so on can. What are we building today? Nothing special, just going through what's new with Tailwind 4 and playing around with it. Which tool do you think is the best for buying domains? So you can use whatever you want, really. Historically, I've bought a lot of domains directly through AWS because I've managed them there, and so it was convenient to also purchase them there. But really, you can buy them wherever you feel like it. I think if you're using a cloud provider like AWS, the advantage can be that you can then also directly manage them there with ease, especially if you also use that provider for other resources and for hosting and so on. But other than that, you can buy domains wherever you like it. What do you think about DeepSeek R1? So I have created a video about that on my YouTube channel, but briefly, it is of course super amazing to see that we can get all that power for the fraction of a cost, as it seems. That being said, I've read a lot about DeepSeek and we've heard a lot about DeepSeek over the last days, I guess. And to me, it's not 100% guaranteed or clear how much it really cost. I think it may be absolutely correct what they said, that they were able to like train it for a fraction of what OpenAI is spending. Of course, you could also think that there might be a strong incentive for the Chinese government to like push a model like this out there into the world and compete with all those other models by the big US companies. Now, actually, well, I guess it does matter, but it does matter and it does not matter to some degree, because it is definitely nice to have this competition. It is nice that it's open source. It's nice that we're not stuck with just OpenAI, which is not open at all, and I guess Google and then Meta, which also published open source models. But it's nice to have competition. Personally, I don't use the DeepSeek API. I don't want to send my data to the Chinese government. You can, of course, argue whether it's so much better to send it to OpenAI, but that's another story. But yeah, definitely nice to have this, or to see this development and have this competition. These are my 2 cents. Obviously, we could talk about this way longer, but it's not really what I want to dive deep into today. Need to head out. My Prime sub is available on February 3rd, and I'll be using it here. Yeah, thank you so much, Scumble. Thank you so much for being part of the stream. See you in future streams, hopefully. I find myself feeling lazy when it's time to write front-end code. Yeah, I totally get that. I'm super lazy when it comes to styling stuff. It's not my strong suit, and it's also not what I enjoy. So I totally feel you there. I don't think people know that ShadCN is almost just wrapping Redux UI. I feel the same. I feel like Redux UI to some degree is the loser here because they do the heavy lifting. Of course, ShadCN also does a lot, but they're just like putting styles on top of Redux UI. But everybody knows, or a lot of people know ShadCN, but not so many people know Redux UI, and that you could use it without ShadCN too. I agree here, yeah. Is the GOAT Maximilian Schwarzmüller channel? Yes, it is. Thank you so much for stopping by, Euler Lead. You can run R1 locally. Checkmate China. True. The big model is a bit hard to run locally. Possible, but I don't have the hardware for that. I don't have it for the 70 billion model either, but I will actually probably play around with running it on some VPS, which is expensive enough. The 70 billion model, I mean, not the super big one. And yeah, being able to take that open source model and run it on any host you want, including, of course, American companies that are already hosting it, though it's then also more expensive as far as I can tell. But yeah, you can access it without sending your data to China. That is true. But not for the price DeepSeek itself is offering, as far as I'm aware. My code is my art. I can relate to that. Okay, so yeah, we got better gradient support, gradient interpolation modifiers. We've added the ability to control the color interpolation mode for gradients using a modifier. Okay, so I guess if you know, unlike me, what OKLCH, or however you are supposed to pronounce this, if you want to use that over sRGB, you can use these variations of the BG Linear 2 wherever you want to go, or of the angle classes, I guess, to control how the colors are calculated. And I do understand that earlier we learned that OCLC gives you more vivid colors. So if you go for that, your gradients are also more vivid, as I understand it. Now, what's the default here? Can lead to more vivid colors. We're using OCLAP by default. Okay, so you get the more vivid version by default, but if you need to fall back to RGB for some reason, you can do so. Okay. Conic and radial gradients. We've added new conic and radial gradients. So that's, of course, nice. We're no longer limited to linear gradients in Tailwind. Instead, we can go for radial or conic gradients to have these styles too. So that is pretty nice. Starting style support. The new starting variant adds support for the new starting style feature. Interesting. I did not know that CSS had such a feature. So I guess with that we can So I guess with that we can apply transitions for when an element becomes visible, which we previously could do with animations, but now also with transitions. And that's built into CSS, right? How is browser support? Yeah, not too bad, not too bad. So as I understand it, I'm not sure if this will play transitions if you dynamically include or remove an element. So if I were to add some state here, some is visible state and set is visible. And then I want to add, let's say, a button here, toggle visibility, and I set on click to a function where I set is visible to the opposite of what it was. Like this. So I could have a button like this. And now let's say I want to control the visibility of that div. Of course, in React, I can do that by checking is visible. And if that is true, I render this div. And if it's not true, I don't. So with that, of course, I don't see that gradient box, but if I click this button, which is not styled right now, but it's okay, it appears and then it's hidden and so on. So I assume I can't apply styles to that with this feature. I assume it only works with that popover API, which is supported by the browser. So if you're, for example, using the official dialog element, I assume that's how that works, but we can give it a try. So if I add the transition discrete class here, or how does their example look like? If I click here, oops. If I take a look at that, transition discrete duration. Okay, so if I go here and wrap this with another div to make sure that my class list doesn't get too long, I can add this transition discrete class here. And then I set a starting style, starting open. Yeah, so with that open pseudo selector here, I assume that this does not work with that approach, but we can give it a try. So I set this to opacity 0, then transition 500, and then let's see, what else do they add here in their example? So on that popover, they have a bunch of stuff which is not important for us here. Transition all. So I'm just trying to understand. Okay, they set the opacity to 100 with this class here. So I'll just try to copy what they have to rebuild exactly what they are using here. So if I use that here, that will not work, this popover open stuff, of course, because I don't have a popover here. Okay, so I guess what should work is if I render this in a different way. If I set this to be a popover, and just to explain what this means, this is an official thing in the web now. You have the popover API, which in the end is about controlling the visibility or the conditional visibility of elements, like a dialog, like a modal, directly with HTML without using JavaScript, essentially. As you can see here, the idea is that you can essentially add this popover attribute to an element, and then you can add popover target with a pointer to the ID of the element that has popover on it to some other element to control its visibility. So the idea here is that I could get rid of my JavaScript code here, actually. And this has nothing to do with Tailwind. This is just HTML, but you can, of course, also use that in React projects. And now I could add an ID here, demo popover, and then set the popover target of my button here to demo popover. And that should now ensure that this gets shown conditionally, which does not work here though. So pop over target, pop over. I'm not sure if it does not work also because of that error I'm getting here, or this warning, received true, because React is not happy about this pop over attribute. Looks like it's not aware of it. So it's an official HTML attribute, of course, but looks like React does not like it. I'm not sure if that's the problem here. So if I removed, I mean, the classes shouldn't have an impact here. Yeah, they don't change the behavior. Could you explain what a popover is again? So the idea is that it's an API built into the browser, so to say, provided by the browser. And the idea is, the idea is that you can decorate or mark an element, any element, as a popover. So as the thing that should be shown conditionally by adding the popover attribute to it. So if you want to show a modal, instead of using JavaScript for showing it, you could set up some element and add this popover attribute to it. You would then also add an ID to that element, and then on another element that should trigger whether that modal is shown or not, you would add popover target and set it equal to the ID of the element that has popover on it and that should be shown or hidden conditionally. So in the end, what you would normally write with JavaScript or React state and so on can now be done with just attributes in HTML. That's the idea. And the dialog element, which is an official element provided by HTML, has that behavior built in already. So it has this popover attribute on it already. You don't need to add it there. So I think that should work. If I use a dialog here, I should be able to get rid of popover, just keep the ID here, and point at that ID here with popover target, and then hopefully control this dialog with this button, though I'm not sure if this will work here. No. So I actually haven't used this API, as you can probably tell, so I'm not sure why it's not working. You can, of course, show it with JavaScript, but I thought you could also do it with just HTML. That was my understanding, at least, of how that should work. Oh, that's a good point. Popover target probably in React. Yeah, camel case. Let's see. Unfortunately not. Unless it's appearing somewhere else. Does not look like this dialog is showing up anywhere. I mean, what if I add popover here? No. Yeah, so I typically always controlled it with JavaScript. I actually also do that in my React course. Not sure how I would have to go about using HTML for that. Because in JavaScript, you can use this approach, which is also shown here in the MDN docs, where you simply get a hold of the elements and then trigger show modal. And I show how you can do this with refs and effects and so on in JavaScript, in React, in my React course, for example. But I would love to get this to work with just HTML elements. but I guess not today. Yeah. Anyways, what's interesting is that in theory, and we can see this here in this demo, of course, you can actually apply smooth transitions that play when an element is shown or hidden with help of this starting variant here. So this starting colon thing that can be added in front of open to essentially tell Tailwind that when this div here is open, which is a state it can have as a popover, it should actually start with opacity 0 and then move to whichever opacity you set up thereafter. So pretty nice, bit clunky. They're also saying that browser support probably isn't quite there yet for most teams, but we're getting close. So it's nice to have that built-in support at least, and yeah, maybe I can also figure out how that works in the future. Add popover target action. So you mean I should add like this? Yeah, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. Does not recognize popover target action prop on a DOM element. Not sure what the problem is. Equals show. Oh, so pop over target like this, and then maybe pop over target action equals show like this. Or do I add that here to the dialog? Let's add it everywhere. It has to do the trick. No. Anyways, it's not too important. What else do we have? The not variant. We've added a new not variant, which finally adds support for the CSS not pseudo class. So that is pretty nice because occasionally I had the situation where I wanted to apply a certain style. I guess everybody has that from time to time if some state is not active. And now with not, you can, for example, say if this is not being hovered over, this should be applied. This can especially be helpful if you maybe have some default style that should be overwritten or anything like that. So from time to time, that can be nice. It also lets you negate media queries and supports queries. Not supports hanging punctuation. So that means I can say, for example, if a browser does not support a certain feature, then I want to apply a certain style. If it does not support dark mode, whatever, I want to apply a certain style. That is interesting. Yeah, definitely. I see the value in having a selector like this. Even more utilities and variants. We've added a ton of other new utilities and variants, including inset shadow, inset ring, making it possible to stack up to 4 layers of box shadows on a single element, field sizing for auto-sizing text areas without writing a single line of JavaScript. That's nice. Color scheme, so you can finally get rid of those ugly light scroll bars in dark mode. Nice. Font stretch. Yeah, so basically more utilities. And as I said at the beginning too, I feel like the idea with Tailwind 4 is essentially to not break Tailwind, to have it work the way it worked before, but to have a Tailwind that's simpler to use, simpler to configure, and more versatile. Has more utilities, makes it easier to dynamically set specific paddings or margins. I feel like that's the theme with version 4, and it feels like they were able to really like meet their goal here and make it more versatile. Okay, and that's it. That's Tailwind CSS4. Okay, yeah. So if you know Tailwind, you will not have problems with version 4. It's the same as before. Everything still works as before, I would assume. They're not mentioning any breaking changes here, I guess. Except for the colors, probably, since they look slightly different now. But the rest, I think, should work as before. But you do configure and set it up differently. And you have like all these simplifications. So that's really nice. Add it to every element. Yeah, I should. Have you met Jonas Schmettman? Yeah, I have once or twice. Loved your course about TypeScript. Thank you so much. Amazing to hear that. Super happy that that course was helpful. Yeah, so I guess that is Tailwind version 4. Now, React Popover API. I'm interested in finding out why I can't get the Popover API to work here. I'd avoid it until it's better supported. I mean, what does our favorite tool, ChatGPT, have to say about that? So it's AI time now. Let's see. Let the AI do the work. Here is 01. Now I'll grab this code. You are I'm not sure if I need to tell 01 that it's an expert React developer, but it won't hurt. Developer with a strong expertise in using Tailwind and working with native DOM APIs and browser features. Also with vanilla HTML and CSS. Below you find some React JSX code that tries using the Popover API to dynamically show, hide an element. Unfortunately, it's not working. Nothing happens when I click the button. What's wrong with this code? So let's see. Tell it it's a junior developer. I don't think ChatGPT will be aware of Tailwind 4, but I mostly am concerned about the Popover API here, so let's see if it knows about that. Maybe it's able to figure something out here. So weird it's working for me. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have some weird typo somewhere. I guess I can also try a different browser. I can try Safari if that helps. What's the 5173? Yeah, so I tried Safari on a different screen. That also didn't work. But let's see, maybe ChatGPT has the magic answer. Next stream on prompt engineering. Let's see. Let's first take a look at this answer here and then see if I should tell you something about prompt engineering. But Uncivil, how is it working for you? So did you add Popover target action to the button, to the dialog, to none of the elements? Any typos here? Do you have a class with an ID with a dash, without a dash? Anything that's different from me? Oh, I got an answer. You're using the new Popover API attributes incorrectly. React is simply passing them through as unrecognized and thus inert attributes, and you also never mark your dialog as a popover in the first place. Well, I thought you don't have to do that, but I might be wrong. Using camel case props versus dash case HTML attributes. The new popover spec defines real HTML attributes named popover dash target, popover dash target dash action with dashes. In vanilla HTML, you would write, yeah, okay. Which is not the same. Yeah, but using dash attributes in React, really, ChatGPT? That is not going to work. I mean, now I'm getting errors in the IDE already. So yeah, that is peak AI, I guess. Yeah, obviously that does not work. But you can't use dashes in attributes props in React. Let's see. Okay, so I guess what I'll try now is add pop over here on the dialog. I mean, we can restart the server too. Maybe something broke there. Okay, no, that was not it. I mean, I am getting a bunch of warnings that all these attributes are not recognized. I guess those warnings shouldn't be a problem. But it does not work. It does not work here for me. I'm also not sure if the popover API is behind some flag I need to enable in Chrome or anything like that. I mean, the IDE should make a difference, but I also got no typo there. And I guess I can still remove that to make sure it's not somehow hidden because it has an opacity of 0, but that's also not the problem here. Yeah, inspect your DOM when you click on it. I did that before, and when inspecting the DOM, so the dialog here, I don't see anything flash or change here, so I'm hammering that button, this one, but it's not doing anything here to the DOM. Okay, got a new answer. You can pass, they're not, yeah. I'm not sure. I mean, they might be forwarded, but yeah, I'm not convinced ChatGPT is going to solve this for us here. I'm using Firefox. Yeah, so maybe it is a browser issue, though in theory, this popover API thing should work in Chrome. And I have version 130, so that should be working, I guess. And it doesn't look too complex here, right? It's just like popover target, done. Alternatively, of course, via JavaScript. But I wanted to see if it works with just HTML. Yeah, but also not too important. I'm pretty sure it will work at some point. Working in Chrome too. Yeah, it's the classic live stream thing, right? So something is off here. I'm not quite sure what it is. I mean, the code is not too complex. You would guess it should just work, but let me go back to a div instead of a dialog, but now it's always visible, but I can't get it to disappear. So I'm not sure. Anyways, that was Tailwind 4 already. So that went a lot quicker than I figured. Popover API does not work on the other hand. So I guess for today, I'll simply call it a day. It was a shorter stream, but I have to go in like roughly half an hour anyway, so it's quite okay to stop here. Yeah, let's see what I'll do. I'll definitely have more streams in the future. Also more project streams again. Definitely want to build some bigger projects too. I'll figure something out. But I hope this was also interesting for you. It definitely was for me. I figured like if I explore Tailwind 4, why not take you with me and explore it together? Might be interesting. Let's see what we do in the next stream. Thank you all so much for being part of this stream, and have a great evening, day, whatever it is for you. It's evening for me. What DeepSeek gave me. Let's try the DeepSeek solution before I wrap this up. So let me replace this real quick with the DeepSeek solution. Nope, does also not work. But doesn't matter. Let's build something nice in the next streams. Have a great day, evening, whatever. And thank you so much for being part of this stream. Bye.